Welcome to Quality Matters, where we speak with experts across industries to see how their perspectives can inform our pursuit of high quality education for all students. I'm Shaka, and this is Caitlin, and we're happy to be your guides for this limited series.
Like you, Shaka and I are passionate about all students having access to a great education, and quality is a driving force behind our work. But what does quality really mean? In an era where parents can customize their child's education, this question is more important than ever.
During each session, we'll hear from leaders in education, technology, business, sports, and the arts. We hope to apply their insights to our pursuit of a great education in the K-12 space.
Join us on this journey to secure a great education for all children. This is Quality Matters.
For today's conversation, we're honored to have my friend Gerard Robinson in the studio. Gerard is a professor at the University of Virginia, and he has an extensive background in education policy, criminal justice, and economic mobility. He is one of only a few people in the country, probably, who has served in cabinet-level positions in multiple states. He served as the Commissioner of Education for Florida and Secretary of Education for Virginia. But recently, he's focused his work on prison reform, aiming to improve educational opportunities for incarcerated individuals. So let's get to it.
Awesome.
Gerard, one of the things that I'm really interested in is this sort of second act, maybe third or fourth act in your career, where now you're working on sort of second chance education. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that and tell us how you first got interested in that topic in general.
Oh, great question. So some people know me wearing two hats. One would be the school reform hat, primarily K-12. Others would know me wearing the prison education hat. And in many ways, they're both the same hat, just different sides. And I tell people there's one thing that people in school reform and prison reform are both interested in, and the word is opportunity. One is for an older population, but some of those people who are in prison now are people who had literacy challenges in high school, may have been a high school dropout, or since we talked about Florida early, they were one of the pioneers of the third grade holdback policy. I know it's very controversial. I'm a supporter of it because I've seen it in action, and I've also seen what the research from Dr. Winters and others have identified. And so my thing is, I'll see you here. Hopefully I won't see you in prison. But in fact, if I see you in prison, I want to use the opportunity word to help you there as well. Now, one thing that most people who would see either side of the hat would not know is that when I was an undergraduate student at Howard University back in the late 1980s, I had run into someone who, her name is Tanya, and she was working with young men in DC between the ages of 16 and 19. Most of them were men of color, primarily African American and Hispanic, and most of the Hispanics in the program were from El Salvador. And there was a forward-thinking judge who, to this day, I don't know his name, who put together an alternative program and said, listen, rather than send you to juvie, what we're going to do is give you access to professionals in DC, whether they were undergraduates like me, Shaka, you went to law school, whether it was law school students like you, government officials, others. And so I spent 2 years working in that program. And the one thing those guys said they wish they would have had were stronger literacy skills. And so even that early, I was like, there's a link between literacy and lack of opportunity. Well, fast forward to the kind of work that we do now, while people know me more for the school choice work, it was actually early criminal justice work in the late 80s that got me started in the whole idea of opportunity for others.
Yeah, that's super interesting. When you think about, we're very much interested in quality, and obviously the theme of this series is quality matters. What do you think about when you're thinking about like quality in terms of education in the carceral system? Because it's such a different system. I mean, though the U.S. has really high rates of incarceration, still most of us aren't that familiar with the system, right? So it's not like it's not K-12 education. So what does quality education look like in that venue?
So you've got right now approximately 1.2 million people who are incarcerated in the United States. Most of those people are in state prisons, the rest federal, and then some are in jail. Approximately 85% of state prisons and nearly 100% of federal prisons have education programs, and they fall into four categories. The first category is adult basic education, and to make it real easy, these are education classes for people who haven't mastered um, the rudiments of math, writing, maybe even English language learning. So you're looking at grade 1 to 8. The
Okay.
second is adult secondary education. That's for people who are going to take high school courses, either to earn a GED or a high school diploma. Prisons have partnerships with K-12 schools. There are a number of K-12 teachers who, after school or in the summer or through a partnership, work with men and women who are incarcerated. The third program is called it's basically called CTE, which is Career and Technical Education. We actually have that in high school. We also have it in prison, and that's for people looking for licensure, a certificate, or a trade. And then the fourth is post secondary education, and that's where people can earn an associate's degree, a BA, in some instances, a master's degree, or a PhD. And so those programs are in place. People would probably be shocked to know that the majority of the people who are enrolled in education programs are in adult basic education. Why? So many people arrive to prison without a high school diploma,
Hmm.
or even if they have one, it was more of a diploma mill and not one focused on quality. And so when we talk about quality in prison, it's pretty similar to K-12. Strong instructors who are certified in her or his area of expertise. Access to technology. I got to tell you, that's a little tough for some prisons. For the ones who do, that's great. And you
Sure.
also have quality standards from the American Corrections Association on here's what we say matters as it relates to educating people in prison. So
That's
it's a
fascinating.
quick overview.
Yeah.
So I'm curious when we talk about quality, there at some point in some of our other conversations, we've had this notion of quality of input and then quality of output. But what I'm actually curious about, and this falls in the category of quality of output, is how would people define, um, like, where are they going? A high quality life. So they're, incarcerated, they're getting these skills. They just have access to all the opportunities, or some of the opportunities that you just discussed as far as education in the system. What are their goals, and what are, I
Mhm.
guess, people participating in the programs, but also the people offering the programs? And if you think about what their goals are, what does the quality component of those goals mean or look like?
Great question. There's an internal quality metric and an external quality metric. So I'll do internal. I was fortunate to receive a grant from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative several years ago. And with that money, I used it to interview and ultimately encourage 11 men and 11 women to write an essay on what it was like to pursue an education in prison. And several of them had one goal in place. It's what I call inner attainment. It
Okay.
was for self efficacy, it was for a better grounding in who they were as a person, it was for the idea of trying to become a better parent once they leave prison. Approximately 54% of men, 52% of women who are incarcerated are parents. I mean, as
Mhm.
we speak right now, nearly 1 in 14 children in the US has a parent who's incarcerated. And so that's the inner attainment, nothing more than that. That's quality.
And they identified that in their work. They identified that that was what their goal was for.
Absolutely.
Okay,
It
sweet.
wasn't to pursue a degree, although some
Mhm.
earned some. So that was the internal piece.
Yeah.
The external part is I want to get a good job. I also want to become a better parent, but I also want to get a college degree.
Hmm.
And so for those people, quality was how do I use this degree to get out so I minimize the probability of coming back? Now, when you think
Yeah.
about it, according to a couple of studies, nearly 75% of the people who leave prison return in 5 years. Now, think about that, 75%. If that was a financial investment And for every dollar I receive the 75% investment, I could donate a lot of money to support Quality Matters. And you guys could do a ton of things.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
great financial return. It's not a
Yeah. That'd
great
be a
human
no-brainer.
return.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And so
Wow.
research shows, whether it's a RAND Corporation or other studies, that those who participate in an education program dramatically reduce the probability of returning to prison. So for them, quality matters because they want to make sure that they get out. If I had to give you a third example, and this is where we get into a debate, it's also external, but how do we define what quality looks like once you're in the free world? Some people
Mm-hmm.
would say, are you participating in civic activities? Are you voting if you live in a state where your votes are restored? Like in Virginia, the governor's got to say yes or no on that. In some states, it's automatic that you receive it. In other states, you can vote while you're in prison. And so we're trying to create something larger than just a recidivism scale to determine what quality looks like. But those are just a few examples that I've seen both in with my own eyes and visiting 13 prisons in the U.S. and other places, talking to people who went through it, as well as looking at research.
Hmm.
I think it's interesting. I loved that you brought up that third one because who doesn't ponder what a high quality life means or looks like? I mean, isn't that in some capacity what we're
Sort
all
of what makes
focused
us
on?
human, right? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Like what we're all trying to achieve. But you know what? I have to admit that I don't know that I consider when I think about that, like all the different subsectors of the population that would be pondering that. And this idea of people that have left prison or jail or whatever, um, their path to achieving that quality life by whatever metric you're using to assess it probably, of course, looks very different. And so I love that that's something being considered by you and your work. And I'd be curious, how that evolves.
One thing that we often overlook, and I wouldn't say overlook, it's something that we don't know or think about because some of the circles that we run in, you have over 40,000 regulations on state and federal books that impact the ability of someone to get a job because of the type of felony or crime
Mm.
that they have. And it varies from almost the inability to do hair. And it took an African woman in Mississippi to bring a lawsuit to basically say, listen, in fact, IJ, if I'm not mistaken, represented her. The IG also did a lot of work in DC to say you actually putting in more hours to do hair than it takes to become a real estate agent. And so you've got it on that end, all the way to how can I become a lawyer? There are a number of people who are now working with formerly incarcerated people who had a felony and they have to take the character fill out the character test or evaluation. So then you
Yeah.
now have people who are practicing law or professors who had to address the character issue because people said, hey, I've done my time. We have to do something differently. And so as I think about the questions you're asking, they're even having me rethink how do I think about quality from the education standpoint where we have very few barriers to bring that mindset into a place where there's over 40,000 points already there to stop people. But, we're working on it.
Gerard, when I first found out that you were, doing this work kind of, whether in the prison system, in the, sort of carceral system or adjacent to it, what it called to mind for me actually was Alexis de Tocqueville.
Yep.
Right. And so if people are familiar with, democracy in America, the reason Tocqueville comes over to the U.S. and this is in the 1700s, right? 17 early 1800s. The
Mm-hmm.
reason he comes over is to examine the U.S. prison system.
Mm-hmm.
He ends up writing all about democracy, but one of the main takeaways was he came over to learn about that and ends up learning a lot about American culture, at the time. I feel like you've kind of been on your own Tocquevillian sort of journey visiting these things. What do you think that relationship is like? Meaning, what have you seen in the incarceration sort of and penal system? What does it tell you about things that maybe in the U.S. we value, or maybe things that we don't value that you think maybe we should?
You're one of the few people who actually bring up Tocqueville and prisons, in part because they'll think about Democracy in America, I believe it was 1835.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
his second book that him and Beaumont put together. As you noted, they actually were sent here by the authorities to study what was a penitentiary system in the U.S. And so their first book, 1833, was the penitentiary in the United States and its applicability to France. And you're correct. And while here he picks up all the other things. And it's smart because prisons really are a microcosm of our values, our hopes, and our fears.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And it would be hard for someone to think that anybody from Europe would want to come to the United States to look at its prison system. Now, when you think of the prison system today, 1.2 million people. And you go back to the start of the country, 1776, up until 1823, America, in fact, was the leading country on the idea of what was then called a penitentiary. Now, while prisons are ancient, and you find prison mentioned 116 times in the King James Version, the idea of using a prison and turning it into a penitentiary is a uniquely American invention, and created in part by the founding generation who said, not only do we want to break away from the mother country in terms of our laws, our moral ways, our language, we also want to do it in what we think about crime and justice. By the time that we're fighting against the British in the American Revolutionary War, England had spent a lot of times going back to 1866 and moving forward under what they call the Bloody Codes. And the Bloody Codes start off as 25 laws, which then continue to grow. And
Mhm.
every time you find yourself convicted of one of the crimes, what was the punishment? Death. And so we said we want to be very different. We didn't want what we call monarchical justice. We wanted Republican justice. And rather than saying stealing something led to death, we said we're going to put you in a penitentiary. And the word penitentiary, if you go back to its Latin meaning, means to be penitent, to repent, to be solace, to think, which is where you get solitary confinement from. Although the Quakers, when they created that, wouldn't think what we have today. So by the time Tocqueville's here, the prison is a really interesting idea of American intervention, American morality, and the ideas of crime and punishment. You won't think that today when you see our prisons, but that's why Tocqueville came today. And I will say today that we still are dealing with the ideas of crime, punishment, and democracy. And I do think our prisons are a microcosm for us to look about what's good, hopeful, and futuristic.
Hmm. Hmm.
I feel like that same notion of prisons being a microcosm of what's good, hopeful, and futuristic. What does that look like? Like, if we were to relate the same statement to schools, are schools a microcosm of what we hope to be good, futuristic, and whatever the third, like,
Mhm.
um, I would hope so, because I think that, when you have schools full of students who are the next generations, they're the next leaders, they're the next unifiers and solvers and advocates. And um, wouldn't you want them to be a representation or a microcosm of a representation of what the world
Mhm.
is to become? Is that the case?
Absolutely.
Is
No.
that right now the case, that what we see in our schools is a representation of what's to come and all of that?
Absolutely. Good, hopeful, and futuristic. So I'll go back to the founding generation. Benjamin Rush is a founding member that we know little about. While he wrote one of the first documents talking about the role of crime and punishment and using solitary confinement to give people a chance to reflect, to repent, and come out, he also wrote a document around the same time on the purpose of education in the United States, or what became the United States. Benjamin Franklin was also in Philadelphia having conversations. And so while we're thinking about creating the Constitution and the idea of creating a constitutional republic, those same people were dealing with issues of incarceration. And what do we do? Now, fast forward to the day today, our schools are definitely filled with good, the challenge, and the futuristic. And I think one of the best things that we can do is talk to people who are currently incarcerated, or who are out. And why? Because 95% of the people who are in prison come out. And when
Mhm.
you talk to them and you say, what could have happened differently in your life to make you pivot, to
Hmm.
make a change? There are a lot of factors. There's family, drug use, lack of opportunity or having opportunity. I mean, I've talked to people who are in prison who have master's degrees, who have law degrees, often white collar crime. Well, one of the things that they often have a link to is, I wish I would have had a better education when I was in school, whatever level they had, or I had a great education. I was good on book knowledge. I wish I had a better idea about ethics and values. And so
Mm-hmm.
somewhere down the line that takes place. And so for the kind of work that we do, yeah, we've got to see how those two things matter, because there is something called a school to prison pipeline. And now that I'm in prison, I call it a prison to college pipeline or prison to school pipeline. But at some point, education, going back to the Latin word educo, which means to bring out of darkness into light, at the end of the day, whether it's prisons or whether it's elementary schools, the pursuit of coming from darkness into light is hopeful, is futuristic, and it's also a conversation about the good.
I love that. Oh, go ahead, Caitlin.
Well, just one quick follow-up question. So as you're talking, which you infuse hope and encouragement into how you speak about some things that don't oftentimes feel hopeful or encouraging. And so I'm noticing just in my own mentality as I listen to you shift a little bit more to this idea of like hope. And so one of the thoughts and questions that I have for you would be, is there a lever, if we're visualizing, is there a lever that either needs to, that you would pull or that you would turn off to sort of affect change in both of those situations, prison to college pipeline or school to prison pipeline? Um, what is the one thing that you think needs to be adjusted or amended
Mhm.
to improve both of those scenarios?
In the
Easy
K-12,
question. It's only one thing, right? Yeah.
only one thing.
Yeah.
I would say
Just one.
In the K-12 sector, the lever is resources. That could be human, financial, technological, or otherwise. I have friends who would pull the money lever. Money is a resource, but money in and of itself is a currency. It's leaving the human dynamic. So I would say the resource lever. For prison, I would pull the lever of second chances, because we can't define people solely by the worst mistake they made on one day or during a week period of time. And we're talking about people who committed heinous crimes. And so I tell people, listen, I'm not soft on crime just because I support education in prison. You do the crime, you do the time. So while I'm not soft on crime, I'm smart about time, because 95% are coming out. What are we doing with the time that they're in there? And so when I say the second chance, maybe it's the first chance because some people didn't have a first chance, but I'll say it's the second chance lever.
Hmm.
What can we do to give you a different opportunity? But I would say during my recent travels to Germany, to Norway, to Kenya, and to Brazil, taking Kenya out of the mix, for example, all of those trips were supported by the Arrow Center for Justice, headquartered here in Northern Virginia. I would say that when I'm pulling the lever of second chances, initially it's for the incarcerated. We have to do the same thing for correctional officers. And I got to say, and I've been at this at a recent meeting or gathering with my colleagues, I got to say with great shame that as someone who has spent as much time as I have working with prisons, being on the board of a college in California that awarded associate's degrees, I spent little time focused on the educational needs of correctional officers until that trip to all three countries, but also talking to Americans, including two former correctional officers who told me three things. The suicide rate for correctional officers in U.S. prisons is higher than it is for U.S. police. Number two, not only is it a tough job on the person who's in the prison, there's a research report I read on a survey of correctional officers in California, and California by far has the largest number of people in prison. Um, 46% of them said they would have a better relationship with their children, a better relationship with their spouse. They'd be healthier if they had another job other than the correctional officer. Third thing is, while we're infusing the ideas of dignity and value to people who are incarcerated, the correctional guards are raising their hands saying, we're stripped of our dignity too. You never say that about us. And so I would say second chance has to be the incarcerated and correctional officers. Again, with great
That's really
shame. I'm sorry I didn't do that earlier.
That's really interesting. Well, and I've got to think too that there's going to be some of those secondary effects if we spent more attention or gave more attention to correctional officers. Is that the environment for those who are incarcerated would also improve, right? Like you're boosting morale for the employees, if you will. So probably you're going to end up boosting morale some for the in the business context. This would be the customer, but
Mhm.
that's super interesting. Gerard, with the little time we have left, I'm curious, and here's going to be a hard pivot, so there's no elegant way to do that. But you are one of the few people, probably in the country, who have held cabinet level positions in multiple states. You were you were the commissioner of education in Florida and also the secretary of education in Virginia. I'm curious as to whether or not you maintained the same sort of construct about quality outcomes from one state to the other, or if the U.S. is sometimes called the laboratory of the states, right? Did you, when you crossed all those borders to get from one to the next,
Mhm.
was it like shifting sand and you kind of had to go, okay, this is, you know, people in Florida don't care about the same things that people in Virginia care about, and there's and so you shifted a lot. How did you think about maintaining some consistency but also being responsive given the changing context?
Well, fortunately, I worked for two governors, Governor Bob McDonnell in Virginia and Governor Rick Scott in Florida, who, of course, managed different states but were unified in one goal, and that was to create a solid pathway to opportunity. And how opportunity was articulated in Virginia was different than Florida. I mean, when you think about Florida, more than 50% of the students there qualify for free or reduced price lunch. In Virginia, it's roughly a third. So already the poverty level is very different. Virginia is a very strong local control state. I would say Florida is too, but Florida had a much larger State Department of Education, but also had a heavier footprint state down on what they could do. And some would say that was good or bad. So that was something that was different. And I think third is you had regional dynamics that drove why people did what they had to do. Virginia, basically in Northern Virginia, is a border community for Washington, D.C. And so a lot of what we did in Virginia, we had to think about what would it mean for how policymakers are thinking in Washington, D.C.
Mm,
Florida, I guess the deepest south you can go in the United States, they were also concerned about Washington, D.C., but they were more concerned about Florida. And if they
yeah.
were looking to compete, it wasn't just with Georgia and Alabama, but it was also Massachusetts.
Mm.
And so it was a different link. Given the fact that Florida's biggest, well, I should say one of its biggest trading partners was Brazil, and you also had a very large Hispanic being primarily, well, not primarily, but heavy Cuban, but
Hmm.
also Haitian population, very different from Florida. And so one of the things I was able to do was to support creating some of our state tests in Haitian Creole and also in Spanish. And
Hmm.
so that kind of challenge per se didn't exist in Virginia, although we have over 50 languages alone spoken at my daughter's high school here in Albemarle County. So those were some of the things that were different. But again, leadership matters and quality of leadership matters. And I was glad to work with both governors because again, they thought the path to opportunity made a lot of sense.
Hmm.
I want to take advantage of your optimism. You've talked about opportunity. From your perspective and all of your many vast experiences, where do you get most excited about what's happening in terms of creating more opportunity for students, for incarcerated people in society? What is right now just um, enthusiastic to you? Because there's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's seeing the alumni of our programs now come of age to be the best articulators for the movement. Now, when you think about it, the charter school movement's roughly 32 years old. And so you now have people who have graduated college, who have families, who are the ones with their own story advocating why it matters. I think about Kips Drive Academy in Atlanta. I'm a founding board member of that school. I was so excited to hear from Ed Chang, our former principal, who now runs a nonprofit in the Atlanta area. And he said he received a phone call from a student whose home we visited, over 15 years ago, that she now is in DC, finished our school, went to Rice University. Guess what? She's purchased her third home. Her brother followed her path. He purchased his first home. I'm sure that her credit score is probably better than mine. And
Yeah.
so you have a whole generation of people who, in one generation, not only broke the cycle of poverty, but who are
Yeah.
now creating the next cycle of prosperity. And that's
Mm.
just one school, one story we know. I know of other schools who have 100 stories. So the K-12 piece, they're now becoming their own advocates, and we're there along with them to support. In the prison world, it's the same thing. I mean, when you think about the fact that this September is going to be the second year since 1994 that incarcerated people will have access to Pell Grants to use to pay for college inside prisons. So when the U.S. Department of Education decided, hey, we're going to move forward with a committee, they basically said we want to make sure we have people with lived experiences. So there were people on the committee who had been incarcerated. One of them is a professor at Howard University, Dr. Stanley Andrus, who has a PhD and an MBA, who's a professor at Howard Medical School and one time was a professor at Georgetown Medical School. There's not only one and Dr. Andrus, there are over 1,000. And in fact, he has a great book called From PhD, no, From Prison Cell to PhD, where
Hmm.
now they're becoming their best
Mhm.
advocates. You don't have to have a PhD or an MD or a JD. There are people with no degree, but who went for, again, entertainment, who are also becoming the best advocates.
Mhm.
This
Mhm.
is hard work in K-12 reform. We don't often get a chance to see it matters. But when someone says, hey, I benefited from the charter school or the traditional school or magnet school or program supported by vouchers or tax credits. You sit back there and exhale, there's one of the starfish that we were
Yep.
able to put back into the ocean.
Yep.
Same thing when I meet the people who are incarcerated. There's a starfish. And so I just know that the work we're doing, there'll be more starfish in the ocean, but we'll also give people an opportunity to be able to see more stars in the sky.
Love
I
that.
love it. I love it. That's
So
a hopeful note. Gerard, thank you so much for spending some time with us and for talking to us a little bit about quality, what it looks like in different contexts, and really educating um, me. I'll speak for myself, but
oh yeah.
definitely educating us about some of the work that you're doing on second chances. We see how much it matters. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Very much. Thanks for
All right.
everything.
Sure. Take care.